Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you all. Can you hear properly? Because this is a very long room, as you may have noticed. And I don't think that the sound projects out. I think that you have to use this in order to hear. Is that correct? Are you okay if you're listening to this? It's all right? Okay. I apologize for this, distance between us. The objective of the meeting is to reduce the distance between us rather than to accentuate it. And I would like to thank you very much for having come this afternoon and made the effort to come. And I think, if I may, I will start by introducing my colleagues, but also say a few words about the past year, about some of the priorities for the future, and some of the issues that we see looming on the intellectual property horizon. And of course, it'll be rather selective. It's not going to be it's not going to be exhaustive by any means, because I think what would be more interesting is to engage in a dialogue afterwards and to be interactive. So seated here on my left is Christian Wishart, who's the Deputy Director General for our Global Issues sector. And on my right is Sherif Sadallah, who's the Executive Director in charge of our Department of External Relations. And seated on my far left is Anna Morovitz-Mansfield, who is the head of our NGO and industry section, and who's responsible for the organisation of this meeting. And I would encourage you all to reach out to Anna because her appointment actually was meant to be a signal that we are more and more serious about wanting to engage with you in the non-governmental sector. So any ideas that you have on ways in which we can do that better, then please feel free to talk to us about it. So let me start then with the results for last year. And I think, look, first of all, one of the things that we notice is that the demand for intellectual property titles continues to consistently outperform the world economy. So if you look at the growth rates in the world economy across the last 15 years in particular, you see that the level of increase in the world economy is consistently lower than the level of increase in demand for intellectual property titles that we see, which is a natural expression of the increased investment in knowledge-based capital and the increased basis of wealth being, or the basis of wealth being increasingly knowledge-based capital or intellectual capital. So in terms of our systems, our international systems, in the PCT, we saw that it grew by 5.1% last year. First time we passed 200,000 international patent applications, 205,000 international patent applications. Interestingly, 80% of the growth came from two countries, China and the United States of America. So China, with about 15% growth, moved into third position in terms of the number of international patent applications filed. So it now goes United States of America, Japan, China, and fourth position, Germany. So China surpassed Germany last year for the very first time. And the United States of America, it grew international patent applications grew by 10%, which is a really large number, a large amount over a very high volume of about 26% of all applications. In our trademark system, Madrid system, growth was 6.4%, which was very good. So that's moving up, and I think that growth rate reflects also the geographical expansion of the system. 91 participating countries at the moment, and we expect that number to grow significantly in the coming years. And then last, our Hague system for industrial designs grew by 14.8%, which is a large figure but it's on a very low volume at this stage. It's on a volume of about 3,000 international applications. And I think we will see that the Hague system will just be completely transformed in the course of the next 2 years, as a matter of fact. Because within the next week or two, the Republic of Korea will join the Hague system for designs. Later this year, the United States of America, China, Japan, and the Russian Federation are all expected to join. So this is going to be a completely different system. And I think that this reflects also an increased, heightened awareness of the value of design as a part of innovation. So let's take the iPhone as an example, and the iPhone added about $30 billion to the value of Apple Corporation, and only about 25 to 30% of the innovation was patents. The rest were designs and branding and marketing. So I think there is a heightened awareness of design as an essential element of the creative economy, and that is one of the reasons why we are seeing increased interest in the design system. In terms of our normative agenda, then if I may move to that, well, the outstanding result last year was the Marrakesh Treaty, and I'd like to extend our thanks to many of you who were involved in the development of the Marrakesh Treaty. We have done various analyses or thinking about, why some treaties are successful and some other normative exercises are less successful. And I think one of the reasons, there are probably several reasons for that, but one of the reasons is the engagement and alignment of civil society, I think. So if you look at the Beijing Treaty, I think that you had an important engagement and alignment on the part of both the studios and the actors. And that was important, as well as, I summarise, as well as all the other parties that are interested in audiovisual performances. And I think if you look at Marrakesh, we ended up with an alignment between the World Blind Union and the visually impaired communities on the one hand, and eventually the publishing communities and the rights holders on the other hand. So I think your engagement in these exercises is an essential element of the success of the exercises going forward. So the Marrakesh Treaty, I think, was an outstanding result. I've said before, but I'll repeat it again, that normally the measure of success multilaterally is that everyone is equally unhappy with the result. But this, in the case of Marrakesh, I think was truly an instance in which everyone was equally happy with the result. So it was an outstanding result, I think, which managed to, on the one hand, respect the international copyright system and its architecture, and on the other hand, deal with the specific needs of an identifiable and meritorious community, namely the visually impaired persons who are blind, visually impaired, or print disabled. So thank you for all of your involvement in that. Going forward with our normative agenda, let me say that, as you're aware, there are probably 4 exercises on that may come to maturity in the course of the next 2 years, in the course of this year and next year. So this in our terms, biennium of 2014-15. And I will cite them without any particular, not in any particular order of priority, but just as they present themselves in a rough chronological order, it may be. But first of all, there is designs again, a proposed design law treaty, which would be a treaty really of business simplification. It's a essentially procedural treaty and simplifying the procedures. When you look at what designers have to confront if they want to obtain protection across several jurisdictions for designs which should be a rather simple matter, because you know, in large part there is no substantive examination of the application. Usually there's no substantive examination of the application. They confront a bewildering array of complexity in procedures, and there's no good reason for that complexity. You know, if there was a good reason for the complexity, then you can exist, of course. But there's no really good reason. So the exercise is really finding best practices for a simplified form of protecting designs, applying for design protection. We're very, very close on it, extremely close. Our committee met 2 weeks ago, I think, or last week? Last week. Our committee met last week, and I think many of you are aware that the outstanding issue is that certain countries, mainly certain developing countries, do not want to agree to the convening of a diplomatic conference to conclude the treaty unless there is an article in the treaty. It is agreed that there is an article in the treaty to provide technical assistance for compliance with the treaty. On the other hand, the United States and Canada are taking the position now, I express it in its latest formulation, that they accept the possibility of an article in the treaty, but they do not accept that an article in the treaty is a condition of convening the diplomatic conference. So we're really down to fine distinctions, and you can see that this does not concern a substantive issue. And the substantive text is, you know, in very, very good shape for adoption. There's not many issues outstanding. We hope that by our May Extraordinary General Assembly, it's May 7 and 8, I think, we will get a positive decision to convene the diplomatic conference later this year. And we think that that would be a very good thing, because first, we don't want too many issues falling into 2015, or it becomes unmanageable and there are too many connections made between not necessarily connected subject matters, first of all. And secondly, it would continue, I think, the process of confidence building that we have seen amongst the member states with Beijing and then Marrakesh. So we think it's very important that the treaty does get concluded this year. Then I think we have, of course, the exercise of broadcasting, and I know a number of you wanted to talk about broadcasting. Well, I think we can say, and Michelle Woods is here, and also Carol Correa, who are both very much involved with this, and Carol has been for many years. And I think in the case of broadcasting, we had a very good meeting in December, but there's a lot of work to be done if the assemblies are going to decide in September this year to convene a diplomatic conference for 2015, which is the objective that they have set for themselves. So we are not pessimistic. We are cautiously, I'd say, cautiously optimistic, but there is a lot of work to be done, and we would just underline that. It looks like, and of course this is for the member states to decide, and the negotiation is underway, but it looks like the member states are edging towards a treaty which would have a fairly narrow scope. It would deal principally with the prohibition of the unauthorised reproduction of the broadcast signal on any media. Now, that's not agreed position, so please let me underline that. It's not accepted that that provision should be in there, and it's not accepted that the treaty should be limited to that. You know, there are there's a penumbra of views, as usual, about what the scope should be, but there is a sort of a little bit of an edging towards this sort of an approach. Some would like it to be broader, more property rights to be included. You know, others are a little hesitant about reproduction on all forms of media. So we need to, I think, more experience with this and to see where it goes. But I think the atmosphere is positive. Then we have the IGC, which is underway at the moment, as many of you know, in a 2-week meeting. It's the second meeting of 3 that are scheduled for this year. And look, frankly, this is a terribly difficult and challenging area. It's our 27th meeting, and it is the 14th year of discussions. So this is really a marathon. And I have expressed the view before that I think it's the area of greatest political risk for the organisation. The demandeurs are impatient. They have been waiting a long while. And we have to find a way of being able to deliver on this particular project. I'm happy to talk more about it, but let me say that it's not easy at all, and Christian is the first to know about this since it falls into his sector, and he's been sitting through the meeting this week in particular. So that's really a major challenge for the organisation. And then I'd say the fourth area that I'd signal is our Lisbon Agreement for the international registration and protection of appellations of origin. Appellations of origin, a species of geographical indication. There are 28 member states involved here who have decided that they want to revise the Lisbon Agreement. And they've decided, at the moment, the draft envisages that the new Lisbon Agreement, the revision, would provide for an international register that would cover both appellations of origin and geographical indications. If you would like to know the difference between appellation of origin and a geographical indication, I suggest you consult the Oracle at Delphi. It's a matter which is fine distinction legally, but the inclusion of geographical indications in an international register is perceived as being a huge step forward, because this has been under discussion internationally in one form or another for a long, long time. And it is an opportunity to establish a truly international register dealing with this area, which I would emphasise is of growing importance, like most areas of intellectual property, is of growing importance, I think, because in an age of globalisation and standardisation, I think that diversity has a greater value, and people look for the specificity of products which is linked to geographical origin. And I think we could also say that in an age of global value chains, authenticity also has a greater value. And for both of these reasons, we find geographical indications being more and more, I'd say, valuable. So that's our normative agenda. Going forward, I'm going to stop talking in a moment, but I did want to mention perhaps 3 areas which are not specifically program related, but I think areas of great interest to the organisation or to intellectual property. One is a fairly abstract point, but I would say that one of the biggest challenges I want to move to the most general level of intellectual property, and I would say that one of the biggest challenges for intellectual property in the future will be getting the right balance between collaboration and competition. So I think that there is a big tension between these two things. So what we see actually is a bigger emphasis on each of those things, I think. So we see in the first place a bigger emphasis on cooperation. You see that in open innovation, which envisages innovation structures and global knowledge networks that are connected. You see it, I think, in global value chains. You can't have a global value chain unless there's cooperation amongst a number of different actors, and the basis of the cooperation is usually information and technology. So you see, I think, you see the sharing economy again, much emphasis on the sharing economy in certain sectors. So you see this great emphasis on cooperation on the one hand, and a lot of developments related to that. On the other hand, we see that in the knowledge economy, competitive advantage is conferred by innovation and intellectual property and knowledge and information. So a greater emphasis on intellectual property as the basis of competition. And I think this tension between cooperation on the one hand and competition on the other hand is one of the issues that is going to be, under consideration in intellectual property in the future. And actually, if you were to read an article by Samuel Palmisano, who was the president and CEO of IBM, called The Globally Integrated Enterprise, that was published about 4 years ago in Foreign Affairs, you see that he talks a little bit about this and says that for this reason, intellectual property will be one of the major geopolitical issues of the 21st century, finding this balance between, information technology being the means of collaboration, but also the means of competition. So now I move off the very general, if I may, and say that in two other areas I'd like to mention very briefly. One is the digital economy. So I would very much like to see or to encourage the member states engage in a dialogue about the digital environment and intellectual property. Of course that's happening. And it's been happening internationally also since the early 90s, in the sense when the Internet treaties of 1996 were first envisaged. So in a certain sense that's happening. But of course, in another sense, there are many developments occurring in this space which are both an opportunity for intellectual property and a threat to intellectual property. And I think we need to pay close attention to this space, and I'm very keen in seeing a dialogue develop on the legal global digital marketplace and how we get to such a result. And I don't think that this is a normative exercise. I'm not proposing a normative exercise here at all. It may be that there are certain normative tweaks that need attention in the copyright system and digital environment. For example, the first sale doctrine, or the John Travolta, if you like, the John Travolta problem of buying 50,000 tunes on iTunes, songs on iTunes, and then wanting to know whether he can give them to his children, bequeath them to his children. Because if he bought 50,000 CDs, he could, but you can't actually. So that's, there may be certain areas that require tweaking, but I think we're talking really about the machinery of the marketplace and how it operates, data standards and so on. And I am interested in trying to encourage a dialogue on this. And the last area I would say is in the development capacity building area, the area of appropriate technology. So I think over the last couple of years, we have been able to put in place a number of the tools which facilitate at least the passive transfer of technology, or the transfer of passive technology. Our program for technology and innovation support centres, for example, our program with the publishers, the scientific, medical and technical and medical publishers, where they make available scientific journals free of charge to LDCs, anyone's in LDs in a least developed country, and at a very moderate cost to low income, middle income developing countries. So those tools I think are very useful, but what I have heard certainly in some of my visits to least developed countries is that it's one thing having the source of technology in a written form, and it's another thing knowing how to actually do this. And so I think the area of appropriate technology is one that we can look at profitably in the future. But of course we always must be aware that we're an agency which is concerned with intellectual property, so we would be likely to be doing some of this in collaboration with others who would be more practical agencies, I think. But I think it's an area that we need to pay attention to. Now there are many things that I have not mentioned. For example, now newly named, if I'm allowed to name it, Accessible Books Consortium, which is the artist formerly known as the Stakeholders Platform, or WIPO Global Research, or many of these things where we have very active cooperation with NGO sector. But perhaps they can come out in the course of our dialogue, and I should stop talking and be very happy to hand the floor to you. So please take advantage of it. We have two ladies, yes, please.
Thank you very much. Alexandra Bhattacharya from the Third World Network. Mm-hmm. I just had a general question about the implementation of the development agenda. What is your assessment in the past few years in terms of how far it's been implemented and mainstreamed into WIPO activities? I know the CDIP is discussing an independent review of the development agenda, so I just wanted to get your feeling about this process. Thank you.
Well, naturally, I'm going to have a rosy view of this matter, and I do, because look, I think that if you go back to 2008, what the development agenda was in May of 2008, 46 recommendations were adopted, and that was the development agenda. So what we've done over the succeeding 6 years is look at practical ways to implement those 46 recommendations. And those practical ways consist, first of all, in the 23, I think, projects that we have formulated and executed and had evaluated, and 3 also that are continuing projects in various forms. And that has been to a value of about 26 million Swiss francs. So I think those projects have by and large been very successful. Now, the development agenda is not just about projects, as you know, and everyone is aware, but we have 2 treaties, 2 multilateral treaties, that mention the development agenda, which is the very first time that has ever occurred. So both the Beijing Treaty and the Marrakesh Treaty acknowledge the development agenda in their preambles. And that area of seeing the development agenda reflected in our normative program is not a secretariat mission. It's not something that we are capable of doing. It's something that the member states have to decide amongst themselves how to give expression to it in the normative agenda. And then mainstreaming, well, I think we've made a lot of progress in this respect. The process with the projects has been to make them part of the regular program and budget. We have a situation in which we hope that our development dimension and our development perspective is not compartmentalized into one sector, but is something that is considered across the organisation in all of the activities that the Secretariat is involved in. So in all of our activities and programs, we seek to consider the development agenda, development dimension of the activities and programs concerned. So I think that we've come a long way, actually. I said earlier that I think that the area of greatest political risk for us as an organisation is the IGC process. If you had asked me that question 6 years ago, I would have said the development agenda. And I don't think it is such an area of political risk now, because I think we have made good progress on it. Nothing's perfect, you know. So please, if you would like to give several questions, then it's better that you all speak.
Sure if it's working. Okay. My name is Erika Dueñas, and I work for the Medicines Patent Pool. And I would like to thank you for the invitation to this meeting. And my question is related to public health and intellectual property. If you have some plans or projects to share with us here, thank you.
Thank you very much. We don't have any. Look, I think what's happening is, first of all, our WIPO research, with which you are familiar, or shall I say something about you're familiar with it? Yes, indeed. So that we're very keen on, you know, improving the participation in it, improving the collaborations that are concluded under it, and improving the hosting agreements that take place under it. So we think it's an important mechanism for, you know, accelerating the sharing of research and intellectual property in these areas, as well as building capacity. So that's one program that we are keen on seeing develop further. As you know, in our Standing Committee of Patents, there is one of the items under discussion, or proposed to be under discussion, is patents and health. I don't think that I'm unaware of any normative agenda associated with that, as opposed to, at this stage, at any rate, a discussion about it. And then I think that our role is trying to provide supportive, technical, explanatory explanations where possible to other instances where the issue of the intersection of health and intellectual property may arise. And finally, we are involved in an active cooperation with the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization, under which we hold a seminar together with the three directors general of those organizations being involved, and under which we have published a publication, as you know, on access to medical technologies and intellectual property and innovation. So that's the scope of our activities at the moment, and we're not seeing, I think, anything outside of that coming from the member states. Yeah. Thiru, I think, was here.
Thank you, Director General. I had 3 questions to raise, but I think for the sake of time, I'll just stick to 2. One of them deals with technical assistance, which has already come up. So would you see that the technical assistance that WIPO is currently providing in the areas of patents and industrial property, do you see that as consistent with the WTO Doha Declaration mandate of using TRIPS flexibilities to provide access to medicines for all? And secondly, in terms of both technical assistance and in terms of balance, in terms of technical assistance, does WIPO have a policy in terms of conflicts of interest, and in terms of seminars, conferences, and panels, does WIPO have a policy on balance? So, for example, on the issue of patents and health, we were recently made aware of a meeting jointly convened by Greece and WIPO on innovation and access to medicines. And what concerned us was that when we looked at the program, there wasn't really any participation or room for public interest voices on the program. Thanks.
Yes, so thank you. So on the first one, well, look, as you know, technical assistance in terms of legislative or policy advice is demand-driven. So it has to come first from the member states, the request, and it's also guided by the policy orientations that they wish to adopt. But of course, without fail, we illustrate, we demonstrate the full range of policy options that are available to member states in accordance with the existing international regimes for intellectual property, including the TRIPS and the Doha Declaration. So this is something that is a matter of standard practice for us. And then it's up to the member states to make their policy choices on that basis. On conflicts of interest, we have various, well, we have, as you know, a chief ethics officer, and we have various policies on conflicts of interest. I don't know whether we have considered it also from the angle of participants as lecturers or presenters at conferences and meetings. I think we need to think about that further, because we may have no one at the meeting, you know, because I don't see who isn't interested in one way, either as a producer or a consumer. So we need to, I think, think about that. You can think of an acute example in the area of medicines, but is an actor interested party in a legal framework for the protection of copyright? You know, so I think this is something we'd need to reflect on a little bit to have a firm position on. Please, gentlemen here.
Thank you. My name is Rolf Malpani. I'm with Medicines Sans Frontières Access Campaign. I'm the policy director. I'll start with a couple questions, although perhaps eventually some of my colleagues will have some also. It was good to bring up WIPO research, which is welcome in one sense in that it is looking at the problems of innovation and the fact that our current patent system does not meet many of the needs of people living in developing countries. But we have been fairly concerned that it doesn't really meet the needs that exist today with respect to medical innovation. And it is not a true pooling mechanism as much as it is just sort of a database of existing, let's say, opportunities without any real structure to push forward with collaborations. So I think it's welcome from our standpoint if there's a real serious rethink around how to make WIPO research work so that it more accurately meets the needs of medical innovation today. But my question in particular with WIPO research is our concern with the geographic scope of the agreements, which is that it only requires 49 least developed countries to be included in the access provisions, which from our perspective is inadequate when you look at the disease burden today increasingly in developing countries, which sits increasingly outside of least developed countries. So leaving out in particular middle income countries where a vast majority of people suffering from neglected diseases and even diseases like TB is increasing, and also where the vast majority of people living in poverty are living today, means that WIPO research is really excluding the vast majority of people affected by these diseases. As a separate question, maybe to follow up, so it just would be to get your feedback or reflection on what we consider to be a problem with WIPO research. A second question we would have is more specifically around technical assistance going to developing countries. One of our concerns has been the repeated use of these seminars to push the idea of pushing for anti-counterfeiting measures, which in our opinion is a subset of a much larger problem around the quality of medicines, which actually should focus upon the quality of medicines and quality assurance measures. And we are concerned that these workshops often are overemphasizing anti-counterfeiting measures and are sacrificing the need to focus on public health interventions to ensure that patients have access to quality assured products.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, look, on the first point, we're always happy to engage in, dialogue, and would be happy to engage in dialogue with you about the shape and direction of BVMH. I would say two comments, if I may. You can only build with what you've got, with the materials that are available. So what we are trying to do is to engage different parties in doing what they are prepared to do. We might have a different participation if we if we change the nature of the thing. So we've got to do what is practical and what is possible, I think, first of all. Secondly, you know, I would just restate what you've said about the middle-income countries, just to make it clear so that everyone understands. The sharing is free. So it doesn't matter whether you're a least developed country or a middle-income country, you are able to acquire, subject to it being available, the intellectual property or the unpublished scientific data for the purposes of research free of charge. There's no license fee there. The license fee attaches to sale. If you develop a product on that basis and you sell it, then that's when the license fee kicks in. So that's to put it in context. And in that respect, there is a license fee for the sale of products for middle-income countries. So then on the technical assistance and the quality assurance, well, you know, we would of course agree with you that this is a larger problem of quality assurance as the, you know, unrememberable acronym of the WHO working group, you know, tells us. However, we are only an intellectual property agency. You know, we can't stray into fields of quality assurance. Now, let's put it in context with other collaborators, other partners, fine. We're quite prepared to do that. But we have to stick to our remit. And that remit is not, you know, does not cover quality assurance mechanisms, other quality assurance mechanisms that the WHO has a responsibility for. But we would be happy to see if we can make that more apparent that this is part of our larger problem rather than the only problem in the area. Yeah. Benoit? And please, and after, yeah, Maggie.
Thank you, Mr. Director Guri. I'm very happy to be here. Yes. Okay, I'm representing Health and Environment Program. So we are African NGO. And my question is concerning how can you, in this research, protect the rights of those who are practice traditional medicines? Thank you.
Well, it's under discussion at the moment in the Intergovernmental Committee. That's a major part of the discussion. And as you know, we have texts on the table for this, and those texts have been discussed for a long while. And what we're looking for really at this stage is a breakthrough. You know, we're looking for a way to express, I think, the need to express the gaps in the intellectual property system with respect to traditional knowledge. So I think one such gap is the original empirical observation of cause and effect, often with respect to genetic resources. And there are many examples of that. So if you look at the hoodia plant, you know, the original observation, empirical observation, if you eat that plant, it has an effect of appetite suppression. Or the original empirical observation that that variety of wild rice was not subject to blight when all cultivated varieties of wild rice were subject to blight. I think that's what's not being captured in the intellectual property system at the moment. Someone who comes afterwards, a scientist, and will locate the active ingredient or the active molecule which is responsible for that effect is covered. But the original empirical observation is not. And I think we're not capturing that sufficiently in the texts at the moment. So there is a big discussion about this, of course, and there's no easy answer, I'm afraid, but it's a high priority for the organisation. Benoit,
Thank you, Director General. You talked about the landmark successes of the Marrakesh and the Beijing, or I should say in the other order, the Beijing and the Marrakesh Treaty. And my question is, what is WIPO planning in the current biennium to promote their ratification and faithful implementation? And would you be able to guess when either of these two instruments are likely to enter into force? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benoit. And yes, you're absolutely right. There's no point in having a new treaty unless it is serving the purpose. So we are looking to those member states who express the demand for the treaty to help us by ratifying the treaty. You know, it's one thing to say you absolutely must have this treaty, you absolutely must have it, and then they promptly don't ratify it. So we are looking to put a little bit of pressure back on the member states who were demandeurs for either of those treaties to actually come forward. Now, I think lots of things, that said, lots of things are happening around the world. So we had a meeting last year in the month of December, if I'm not mistaken, where we had at the ministerial level for West African countries, and that covered both Beijing and Marrakesh, and we got, I think, extremely good commitments from all of the countries, of 14 countries represented, 16 countries represented, of their intentions to proceed to ratify both of those treaties. I think we run into the problem around the world always of priorities, that there are lots of priorities on legislative time, and we have to slot our way into those legislative agendas. I believe that in the United States there are active preparations for the process of ratification of both of the treaties, although there's a long way to go. So I think there are many signs that we see. We also see it in terms of the number of countries that ask for authentic copies of the treaties, because that's what they need to put before their parliaments, and that's a good indicator that they're actually seriously in the process. Hazarding a guess is, well, as they say, you know, it's very dangerous to make predictions, especially about the future. You know, so I'd say a couple of years we need. Please, and please.
My name is Enrico Natale. I'm speaking on behalf of the International Federation of Library Association. I want to thank you for the meeting and this opportunity to meet you, and state that IFLA is committed to the ongoing discussion inside the NCCR on the matter of copyright exceptions and limitations for libraries and archives. We're looking forward to the next 27th session of the CCR, and we are actually working with our members to source relevant information for the discussion, especially on the fact that libraries are central actors of the knowledge economy, but also that they do not operate anymore in a national framework. And in this context, we are a little bit concerned by the fact that equal time would be dedicated to the discussion on exception and limitation for library and archives, in regard also to the discussion on the broadcasting treaty. So we would welcome the idea of an intersession specially dedicated to the limitation and exception for library. And I wanted to ask you what guarantees can you maybe provide to the fact that equal time would be dedicated to both objects?
Yeah, why don't we collect a few more questions, and then I'll come back, if I may, and come to the libraries. Okay, please, gentleman here.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm from the Center for Internet and Society, an organization from India. I'm not sure if this question should be addressed to you or to the Secretariat at large. One of the things we were concerned about is the possibility for increasing remote participation. Seeing that we're from a developing country, our budget doesn't really allow us to attend as many meetings as possible. So if there's some mechanism for us to not only follow the meetings online, but also to possibly participate in the meetings, that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Please, the lady here, then the lady on the right, lady at the end, and the lady on the right, and then.
Okay, thank you. My name is, thank you very much, Director. So my name is Yuan Chu. I'm from Medicine Sans Frontiers. I just have a follow-up comments and small questions regarding the topic of public health, because regarding the feedback you just gave in terms of technical assistance, I wanted to follow for your opinion in the context of development agenda. You mentioned there is a proposal in discussion related to patent and public health. It has been going on for nearly 4 sessions, if I understanding, under the Standing Committee of the Law and Patent without approval. Although we appreciate it's a member state-driven process, but I do see there's a lacking of commitment or correct direction from the secretarial level in terms of guiding this discussion going forward. A number of examples, for instance, the research or the studies prepared by the secretarial on the patent exceptions and the limitations maintain the very neutral tone without really integrating the development agenda recommendations, say we need to mainstream some of the public health perspective in the technical analysis. So I think in this regard, I want to know what would be the forward plan from the secretarial level to move in this agenda forward after 4 sessions of discussion. And secondly, a few questions about the patent information transparency, which has also been discussed and in the context of public health. For instance, the proposal that hasn't been approved mentioned the recommendation of including IANA into the pharmaceutical patent disclosure, which from public health perspective is very important to identify the variety of patent around a given medicine, which is often a strategy used by the industry to prolong the monopoly in the market. So in this regard, there hasn't been really very much study or position given from the WIPO side to guide this discussion forward. So I just want to know what's your opinion on this. And then probably last question is about the our colleague from KEI's question about technical assistance inconsistent with the Doha Declaration. So I wonder, although you have explained the standards, procedure, and the practice of WIPO, but I'm wondering in cases the national patent law is under reform, but sometimes some country was put under very heavy political pressure to adopt TRIPS Plus provisions or other provisions that might have the harmful impact on the public health and other public interests in the country. And it's very rare to say WIPO has given any position or analysis in those circumstances. So I was wondering, is there any comments from your side, whether this is the mandate demand or whether WIPO is considering to engage more of this political economy discussion in terms of country patent law reform? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ahmed, we'll take one and then I'll respond to a few.
Thank you, Director General, and thank you for the opportunity of having this discussion. Actually, my question related to the UN post-2015 development agenda. I know the sector of external relations has been following this closely and participating in the New York meetings. But this question is very paramount in all the UN system now, and there's a lot of interest in it. So in addition to WIPO following the UN process and being part of the UN task team, I think there could be appetite for a kind of a seminar or a discussion on that with different stakeholders, and it could be very timely. There's a lot of interest in that, and I'm encouraged by seeing that tomorrow there's a special book presentation on why global development succeeds that is hosted by the economics division. So it was just a suggestion on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity here to speak. My name is Carola Streul. I'm representing Collecting Societies for Fine Arts and Photography, European Collecting Societies. And I have 2 issues I would like to mention. One thing is you were talking about the digital economy and the dialogue you want to initiate. And I would be much appreciating to be, if our constituency would be included in this, because we're extremely concerned about the more and more industry-led solutions, which are putting the authors' rights in their position more and more in the backstage. I just heard about the new draft of the Spanish legislation, which includes a new remuneration right for kind of Google services where explicitly visual creators are excluded from remuneration in the legislation, which I think is discriminatory. That's something of particular concern. The other issue I want to raise here is the resale right for the artists, and I'm particularly grateful for the lunch event which was organized with the help of Michel and Carol in December, and which attracted many interested parties and many member countries, delegates being there. My question is about the follow-up and possible technical assistance. We have now also the interest coming from African countries, and in particular Senegal is interested in taking a lead to demand support from WIPO in this matter. First of all, it's about making the right work in the countries where it is in the legislation but not applied. In Africa, there is a growing interest because contemporary artworks are bought at cheap prices from the artists in Africa and sold at high prices in London, and nothing flows back to the countries. That is my question, what could be done? There are member countries also from developing countries interested to raise the question.
Okay, well, let's have a shot at some of those, and then we'll come back. So first, on guaranteeing equal times, I'm afraid we can't give guarantees, but the intention is equal time for IFLA. The intention is equal time, and it's not really within our capacity to force member states to do anything, really. I would say, look, the only other thing to consider is that we have to take issues one at a time. We don't have any better way of doing things, and the best way is to take things as they are, as the most mature presents itself. Now, I understand that libraries feel that, you know, there was a timetable set, and this is very important. On the other hand, broadcasters have been talking since 1996, you know, about their rights. So it's not like it's a new issue that has suddenly crept in and pushed libraries out of the way. On the contrary. So I think, you know, the intention is there for equal time, but with a little bit of patience, I think the member states will progressively knock off one after the other. On remote participation for the Centre for Internet and Society from India, I think it's a good suggestion, if I may say. We have, as you know, fairly recently only provided for remote viewing, so remote participation will be a new phase. I think that will have to be discussed with the member states because it's a question of time management too. But certainly a very valid point. On the series of questions from MSF, look, I would have the following comments to make. We've got first of all, as far as the SCP is concerned and its agenda, I think one of the big questions that's arising amongst the membership for discussion at the moment is the number of meetings that we have as an organisation and how to manage that. So a lot of member states have expressed the view that we have too many meetings, first of all, and secondly, that our meetings are too inefficient. So in an era in which public resources are stretched and in which, you know, governments have to find budgets to send delegates to participate in meetings, we are hearing them saying increasingly, well, we would like to see a better output to input ratio and more efficiency. Now, one of the things that's arisen, I think, questions in relation to the public health question in the normative committee of the Standing Committee on Patents is, to what extent is this a normative question, and to what extent is this a pre-normative dialogue or discussion? Because if it's a pre-normative dialogue or discussion, then maybe you can hold a conference for it. And that would get a freer exchange of opinions, because people would be less constrained that they're in a negotiating mode. And I think that's one of the things that is animating people's mind in that particular area. The second thing I would say is, please don't ask the Secretariat to do the work of the member states. We can't make people agree on anything. You know, our job is to facilitate. And so we can't be taking a position. We must be taking a position which is neutral and which facilitates a discussion between interested parties. We're not an interested party. You know, the interested parties are the ones that have to take their position. So I understand that you have very strong views, understandably, because you're working on the front line and very interested in saving lives. And so I understand that. But you are an interested party. We are not. And we can't be an interested party in this discussion. There's no more sensitive issue, in my view, in the intellectual property world than health and intellectual property. And I don't think that there's any one simple answer to it. I'm afraid it's a very, very complex question, as you know. A very complex question, and it's going to remain a complex question. And we're going to have to find the balance between encouraging investment in innovation, because we do need that. There is absolutely no doubt that we need to have investment in innovation on the one hand, and on the other hand, sharing the social benefit of the innovation. You know, there's no point in having innovation unless there is a social benefit to it. So that's just not an easy question. And all we can do is facilitate a dialogue which we hope comes up with equilibrium positions here, 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 without anyone being absolutely right. And then on the question of pressure, well, I'd give a similar answer. I mean, we can't substitute ourselves for governments. Governments have to, you know, stand on their own 2 feet and assess what their priorities are in the context of their agendas. And what we have to do is to provide neutral, professional advice as to the full scope of possibilities that are available to the governments. Then for Ahmed, I think, thank you very much for your suggestion. I see STD. Thank you very much for the suggestion on the post-2015 agenda. Yes, only thing I would say is that one of the major challenges of that is going to be to have a manageable and comprehensible post-2015 agenda, and 60 priorities is not going to do it, you know. So that's our problem, I think, from our perspective. You know, we would love priority number 1 to be innovation, and number 2, you know, cultural creativity, but that's just not going to happen. You know, there are more pressing priorities. So, and then on fine arts and photography, yes, of course we would. The point of the dialogue would be to be inclusive and to hear all points of view about this. And there are, you know, and precisely the sorts of difficulties to which you point, I think, are the reasons why we need the dialogue. Because a lot is happening in this space. And a lot of the developments, which may be business or industry developments, have policy implications. And that's why I think we need to bring those out in a dialogue. And on the resale right, yes, thank you very much for this event, which, as you say, was a very successful event. And I think it's got some promise, because going back to why Beijing and Marrakesh happened, you know, one of the reasons I cited earlier was the alignment of interests in civil society, if you like. And I think another reason was the identification of an issue that was specific and that required a technical solution, and that could assemble a political consensus. So I think everyone was happy to come around the specific issue of actors or audiovisual performances and say it is an injustice that they are not covered in the international copyright framework. And everyone is able to come around VIPs and say it is an injustice, the book famine, and we need to address it. And I think the resale right may be such an issue that you can get an international consensus around. Maybe, you know, I wouldn't want to be cited for being too radical about this, but you know, it's just the sort of issue that you might be able to do something on because people can see the reason for it. You know, it's apparent, it's transparent, the need for the artist, and it's not too much to bite off. It's something that's achievable with a specific and technical solution. So I would encourage you to continue.
Okay. Cristina Amado Pinto. I'm representing the Ibero-American Alliance of Broadcasters for Intellectual Property. And you've mentioned the broadcasting treaty, and I think we agree with your view that there was a lot of work, of progress done in the last meetings, and it is the most mature subject in the SCCR agenda. But given there is also a lot of work to be done, especially on the treaty language for the next SCCR, how do you think? What is your view that so that at the next SCCR we can progress constructively, especially given the lack of flexibility of some member states?
Okay, thank you very much. Another one? Yes, please, gentleman here.
Thank you, Director General, for this opportunity. I'm Massimo Vittori, representing Origin, which is probably one of the few institutions on top of the Oracle that would be in the position to explain the difference between GIs and appellation. So that's why, not surprisingly, a lot of interest for Lisbon. So we're very pleased with the advancement with the works, and probably next year the calling of diplomatic conference. And we believe that on top of the treaty making work, we encourage WIPO to put a lot of emphasis on technical assistance for developing countries that to be in a position to join this treaty should have the possibility to consolidate some of the existing geographical indication appellation of origin. And in this respect, also we would like to encourage WIPO to work on some new trends of international cooperation, namely the possibility, for instance, for multinational corporations in the agribusiness, in the agri-food business to work with developing countries to develop alliances in order to help these countries to come up with geographical indication in the field of coconut or coffee, for instance. There are a lot of examples that are very successful, and I think we would be happy also to provide you some inputs in this respect. We have some of our members that have signed this kind of agreements and are very successful, and somehow they modify one of the generalized concept that multinational and developing countries all the time have clashes. Second issue is the generic top-level domains. And we are aware that the train might have left the station probably in some respects. We're aware of also some problems with ICANN governance, although some progress also are being made in these days. We would like WIPO to work and to provide some intellectual inputs vis-a-vis, in particular vis-a-vis the risks that generic string like the .wine, .organic, .food might pose in terms of, generally speaking, to confer somehow monopoly rights to private companies that will manage in the future those strings. Some of them have been already delegated. For instance, I'm thinking .coffee, again, to link it up with developing countries. And also the more classical problem of the possibility for geographical indications to be part of the uniform dispute resolution mechanism policy, because now they are excluded, and also some to work and to clarify some legal uncertainty with respect to the trademark clearinghouse. We have heard that geographical indication might qualify to be included in the trademark clearinghouse, but it's not clear if this is true, and we'd like some work to be done in this respect. Probably, as you mentioned, in the digital economy and IPR agenda, for instance, it's something that could fit. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. The gentleman down the end, yeah?
My name's Dr. Balasegaram. I work with Médecins Sans Frontières as well. And in fact, I just want to make a couple of comments. First of all, I'd like to thank you for convening this meeting and giving us the opportunity to meet and talk to you. Secondly, I'd just like to give you a perspective, not talking as someone coming from my organization, but someone with 20 years experience as a medical doctor and a public health physician, very much working in the international perspective. I do understand very much the point that you made about collaboration and competition, and I do agree with you that this is going to be one of the big challenges. And coming from the public health field, in fact, we do see a very big tension between the collaboration aspect and the competition aspect. And it's very much reflected in this whole innovation versus access debate, which I think is often presented in very much a kind of false dichotomy. But ultimately, what I would say to you is that as a public health physician, I really do struggle to understand what the current framework of the intellectual property system offers to the public health community. Why do I say that? Well, if you look at some of the issues around the public health guarantees and safeguards that were discussed more than 10 years ago and debated and even enshrined in declarations, we see a very strong pushback coming back through a lot of trade agreements that are really promoting measures that are called TRIPS Plus, but we don't really perceive as being in the public health interest. And I think that I think this is a very fundamental point, because it raises on another issue you talked about, which is about budgets and affordability. And one of the big struggles we have in the field of public health is the fact that we are facing an era of moving into a very cash-strapped perspective of governments, struggling to meet their own budgets, but even international organizations like us are struggling to rationalize medical care. I don't think that I feel I'm a radical to talk about public health as an interest. It's not an interest of an individual group. It's a societal need and a societal benefit. And I would strongly encourage WIPO to start thinking in terms of public health as something as a societal benefit and something that belongs to society and not an individual or group kind of activist push. And therefore, I would really ask, what can WIPO do in this area? I think it's important for WIPO to reflect a little bit on the impact of some of these new measures on public health. And I think maybe to understand a bit better, possibly the negative impacts, and provide advice to countries and governments. Because you mentioned about policy choices being in the realm of individual governments. Well, that's true in theory, but in practice, we know that it's a much more complicated picture. And on top of that, when you talk about public health, you often have to be more transnational in your approach, because international public health interventions go beyond individual countries' needs, desires, and I would say interests. And therefore, I think the policy guidance and that WIPO can offer on, I think, the challenges that some of these shifts in intellectual property can have on public health is quite important. I'd like to finish by the comment going back again about this tension between innovation and access. I work in several disease fields. I'm not a specialist in one area, but in many of these fields we've really seen a real lack of innovation. And in the last 10 years we have overtly dependent on public funding and philanthropic funding. So it's very difficult to understand how this system is really working for us. And likewise, I've also spent 10 years working in R&D and drug development, and I know full well that, in fact, your point about collaboration is very important. If we are looking at true needs-driven R&D, we need much more collaboration in the field. And in fact, fragmentation of the R&D has been a major problem, and why, in fact, I think we haven't delivered in a timely fashion. So I would just like to end there, because I'm not a technical or legal person, but I wanted to just mainly give a public health perspective.
Well, thank you very much. May I perhaps knock off a few, and then we'll come back to, or try to deal with a few. Look, for the Ibero-American Broadcasting Alliance, first of all, welcome, and this is a great development that you exist, and that we will have another, I think, occasion at the next Standing Committee on Copyright hear from you in a side event. We can't cure, unfortunately, the lack of flexibility that might be demonstrated by certain member states, unfortunately. And it's a very painful process, of course, and this long process of trying to get people on the same page. So I don't have a ready answer for you on that. But, I would remain cautiously, underlined optimistic, cautiously. I understand there are some who are locked in mental frameworks that belong to a different technological reality, and that is not helping us go forward. So we'll see. I think we'll have a better idea after the next standing committee. For Origin, there were a great deal of questions. We see that rising interest in developing countries, and we are doing more and more that related to geographical indications because, of course, agriculture is fundamental to most economies, in most developing economies, and we see this is a good way of being able to advance the specificities of that each of those countries have to offer. As you put it, for the multinationals in the agri-food business, we'll of course have to get a clearance from our new conflict regime when we approach this. But generally speaking, I think public-private partnerships have a lot to offer, and a lot to offer, and a lot to offer in terms of practical assistance in how to get off the ground. On the GTLDs, well, there are a lot of questions here, it's not an easy environment in which to operate. We don't take the policy decisions. WIPO doesn't take the policy decisions. Those decisions are taken by ICANN. Now, as you mentioned, we've seen some movement in that space recently, which may suggest an evolution in the way in which ICANN operates in the future. And so that may provide more opportunities to be able to deal with some of the intellectual property questions, or it may provide less opportunity. We're not quite sure, actually, yet, which way that will evolve. And on the intellectual input that you would like to see us contribute, well, it reminded me when you said that when we did our first internet domain name process back in the late 90s on this, we opened up our recommendations for public comment, and one of the comments was, that the recommendations were a disgrace, and please take the word intellectual out of your title. So, but we will try to make some intellectual input, have some intellectual. We try to work with ICANN all the time to sensitize them to that, but intellectual property is not necessarily their highest priority. They're going elsewhere. But thank you for your comments in this regard. And then to Dr. Balasubramaniam, I think, was it? It was, if I get your name correctly. Well, thank you for all of those comments, and I appreciate it. But look, one of the things that I would point out to you, if I may, is that we don't have a binary environment for intellectual property anymore at all. If you went back 20 years or 30 years, you did have a binary environment. You had the national and you had the multilateral. But now we have this extremely complex environment, policy environment, in which you have national agendas, bilateral agendas, plurilateral agendas, and then regional agendas, and then multilateral agendas. And that's a very complex environment, which I think is new to all of us. We're all trying to understand what it means and why it's happening. And so we're stuck a little in this. So I think, if I may say, if you'll permit me, you are tending to conflate intellectual property across all of those different environments, the developments in all of them, with the multilateral. I mean, we're one part of it. And our influence is limited to that one part. So we have no influence over bilateral negotiations. We have no influence over plurilateral negotiations. That's the reality. That's why they make them bilateral and plurilateral. You know, that's the whole point. So that's a very complex environment that I think we see now, which is a relatively new phenomenon, I would say. And we have to negotiate and navigate that environment in a way which maintains the relevance of the multilateral. Naturally, we sitting here believe in the multilateral. We believe that the multilateral gives states the greatest amount of protection. It reduces vulnerabilities of states to operate in a multilateral environment. But the reality of the world today is that it's a multi-speed world. Just looking at it, that's the reality. And I think that we need to be looking, you know, thinking about that architecture and what it means for policy development, because that's how it's happening. But well, many of your other comments, you know, I'm totally understand and, you know, sympathise with. So the lady here, please.
I'm Philae representative. Philae is a Latin American organization that represents performers' rights. And thank you, Mr. Director General, for giving us the opportunity of this meeting. There are 2 points where I would like to raise the attention. One is that in spite of the WPPT treaty, which regulated the rights in the internet, we are seeing now, and we are worried, because performers' rights are weakening in the internet scope in spite of this regulation. And this is why, because other right holders, which are in a better bargaining position than performers, are weakening this position of them and these rights. In our view, we should find a way where performers could be fairly remunerated in the internet scope. And in our view, this could be following a system similar to the directive for rental rights and rental and lending rights in Europe, which states a remuneration right for performers similar to the rental right included in it. So it could be a way to strengthen the performers' right and to avoid this weakening of them. That because even the directive, the European directive, is in the end stronger than the WPPT treaty, and Philae performers are in a wider scope than the European scope. This is why we would like to have some action from WIPO, or to see how it could be improved to get this right in the internet scope for performers. And the second question relates to the Broadcasters Treaty. As you said, the Broadcasters Treaty is going to be to focus only in a very restricted and limited area. In our view, if the Broadcasters Treaty is for the protection of the signal, it could be a good way to regulate the scope and the rights of the broadcasters. But in any case, we see that broadcasters are going to be granted some rights, and we would like that performers are have their rights in a balanced way referred to broadcasters. We mean that there should be a possibility of authorizing, of asking the authorization of the rights to performers and to other right holders, such as producers in this case, or at least a remuneration right for them. Because on the contrary, a broadcasting treaty that is it's aimed to protect the broadcasters could weaken also the performers' rights. So it would be better to balance this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. François?
So I'm François Curchot, representing CEPI, the Center for International Intellectual Property Studies. Thank you very much for this opportunity to meet with us on a yearly basis. This is much appreciated by everybody, I think. Last year, you said that one of the big focuses for WIPO in the coming 2 years would be improving the Madrid system. and work to improve the Madrid system has started in a very satisfactory manner. And I would like simply to encourage you and your staff to go on in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ahmed?
Sorry, I apologize for taking the floor again. It was not my intention, but I was prompted by one of the interventions. You know, the Marrakesh Treaty was a historic treaty on many counts, and one of them, actually, that is not often noticed, is, to my knowledge, is the first international intellectual property instrument that contains in its preamble a reference to human rights and human rights instruments. And that brings the whole debate about the issue of intellectual property and human rights. And that is debated in many fora. Most recently, the Council of Human Rights in Geneva, a statement was made by almost 90 countries urging international IP organizations to adopt a human rights approach in their work. I'm just pointing to that in the sense that this is, I think, an emerging issue. Many countries, including Egypt, I just wrote about it, have adopted human right IP in their constitution under human rights. And if you call it as areas of political risk, I see that many people are grappling with this equation also. And I know it's fraught with a lot of difficulties for WIPO, but I mean, I have been interested in this, and when I Googled this on WIPO and human rights, what appears is a 1998 report of a very interesting seminar that was held between the Office of the High Commissioner and WIPO on this issue for the 50th anniversary of the Universal Human Rights Declaration. But I think it's an area that again, there's a lot of appetite for it, and again, I know that you see far in the horizons before things kind of become a challenging thing.
Thank you, Jens.
Thank you, Mr. Director General. I'm Pierre Scherp from Health and Environment Program. First of all, I would like to thank you for the occasion to meet you and to get a better insight of what happens at WIPO and what will happen in the near future. You mentioned the ICC procedure as a political problem, and you are surely right, because not long ago than yesterday evening, Sweden expressed his will to withdraw from these processes, and the Ambassador McCook was obliged to interrupt the session and to find a way to get Sweden back to the negotiation. So could you just give some ideas in which way you would try to push the IGC forward to in order to get to an end before everybody will be too tired or maybe even dead? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jens.
I'm Jens Bammel from the International Publishers Association, and I would like to first make a comment on the far too long and lengthy and extensive number of meetings we're having at WIPO, and then I'd like to suggest another meeting. So first, just a rant. I think this year has been a record in how the number of days that are actually committees meeting. I think it's over 130 days, I think, at least the ones that I should be attending or should be following. And I find that an incredible burden. And I'm delighted to hear that the member states also consider that a burden. With all that, and with your tool of budgetary constraints, which you always have, I think you should take this as a wonderful lob to you, which you can now smash into the court by seriously discussing ways of making this procedure more effective. And anybody who's attended any of these 1 week, 2 week meetings has a sense for the time that is actually usefully spent and the time that isn't usefully spent, and the way other organizations with equally complex problems are able to have meetings which don't take longer than 2 days. So I would strongly encourage you to take this opportunity when they say, we have to improve this. Please do that. That also is connected with the question of communications. We can, of course, all look at the website, which is much improved, and by the way, congratulations to that, and see all the wonderful documents. But when we read the wonderful documents, you don't actually know what's going on in what meeting, or where the state is, or what's actually happening, or whether we are, 2 weeks from a...
So they're well written.
Yes, they may be well written, but it is a great compliment that this room is so full, and it's a great sadness that it is only so full here, because there's so many NGOs here and that are accredited as observers, and it is so difficult for them to choose the meetings that they should go to and can attend and think about what is worth their while. And that's why I'd like to suggest, I found your presentation extremely concise and useful and told me a lot of what's going on, even in the committees that I'm not in. I'd love to see an NGO open day at WIPO where actually it's not just you, but the other assistant and deputy directors or the staff responsible for committees gives an honest or at least a concise summary of what's going on, and therefore gives us all the opportunity to occasionally once a year come and take stock of what's happening. And my final point on that is, now that we have an NGO liaison officer, it would be great if that institution would have the license to be a little bit more journalistic about what's going on and what's happening, so that we all have an even better sense of what's going on than through the already incredibly voluminous and now more comprehensive and more beautiful website. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll take those if I may. So for Philae, noted, I'd say, noted your comment about performers' rights and difficulties on the internet, and I think this joins the comments that I made a little earlier about the dialogue that we need to explore what the impact of the changing technologies and business environment are on, our cultural creators. And so noted. And broadcasting, again, I can only say noted, your view of the scope that the Broadcasting Treaty should have. And obviously there are some member states that are inclined to your view, absolutely, about this. But I'm not sure with that we're going to come out with such a big scope for the treaty. Let's see from the next meeting how we go. To François Curchod, thank you very much for the Madrid system comment, and this will continue to be a major priority, and I think our strategic plan is looking like being a 3-year plan, actually, so I hope that you will progressively see improvements in the quality of the service over that time. And Ahmed, yes, very much noted the intellectual property and human rights. I did have occasion to address the question I think last year on Nelson Mandela Day in the Human Rights Council, and I do see the growing interest in this perspective and looking at things from this point of view. On the IGC, what's the way forward? Well, for health and environment, look, I think that basically we are getting to the stage where we have exhausted the technical discussions, and what we need is a political discussion. I think we now need to get political engagement because that's the only way in which we will be able to get over the technical discussions and move this forward. So it's very complex. I'm not sure what the right answer is. And to Jens from the IPA on the number of meetings, thank you for this. I think this is obviously a growing consensus now that there are too many meetings. A lot of people focus on time and meeting management as part of the solution. I must say that of course, we can make improvements there, but I don't think that's the real problem. I think that perhaps we have got ourselves into a situation with standing committees in which we feel that because they're standing, they have to meet. And we should remember, in my view, that they are normative committees. And I think if they don't have a normative agenda, there's no point in them meeting, because we can have a much richer conference. You don't need accredited governmental delegates for a conference, for a discussion. a conference or a discussion can be much more open if they're not in negotiating mode. So I think, if I may say, if I may put my neck out and say, one of the problems with the Standing Committee on Patents is it doesn't have a normative agenda. You know, the discussion on health and public health and intellectual property is a pre-normative discussion. It's an exploratory discussion in which we're looking for information, we're looking for positions and so on. So, and that a better environment for that might be a conference and a more efficient way of communicating information and positions. So I think part of the answer is moving the programming responsibility up to a higher level so that committees get instructions. Please do this, you know, because at a higher level they have taken decisions about what the agendas are, rather than having a committee which in the worst manifestation meets and, you know, it concludes its meeting at 1 a.m. on Saturday morning without having agreed its agenda. You know, so if it doesn't have an agenda, why should it meet? And on communications, well, I can only sympathise with what you say, and say that it's I think it's a massive problem. You know, a massive problem because we're for all international organisations, and some are better than others, but we're facing a situation in which I don't think anyone under 30 reads any document in the UN system. Well, why would they? You know, it's just not what they're used to. They don't. That's not how they receive information. So we really, and soon that'll be under 40 and under 50 and under 60, and then no one will be reading anything. So we need to, I think, really, you know, it's a big problem because if you want us to engage, which we are doing with social media and other forms of more succinct and let's say, I'm trying to find a euphemism for honest, which was the word that you used, but a more direct way of communicating information, then we are going to have to think about the role of an international civil service and what we can do and what we can say. Now, I'm sure we can improve. You know, it's not as dramatic as that we're completely locked into a 50-page, you know, evasive document. We're not. We can find ways of communicating information more directly and better, but we always have to be a bit careful that we respect the fact that we are a secretariat and not the member states. It's a big problem. Okay, any other questions? Or we're nearly there, I think. Dominique, please.
Thank you, Francis. Actually, this is not a question, but really, since I guess we're getting to the end of this meeting, I really wanted, on behalf of my organization, and I guess hopefully many of those that are around this table, express a token of appreciation for all the terrible amount of work that you've done for all of us during your mandate, and the tasks that you've accomplished so well during that time. You have been able to achieve very, very substantial outcomes in a very difficult political, economic situation around the world, and really to move WIPO up to higher grounds and a different level with a lot of vision, much transparency, at least as much as was possible, and certainly a very inspired and inspirational leadership, together with your secretariat, of course, and just to say how much we look forward to continuing this good work with you during your next mandate.
Okay, thank you. Great. Thank you. So thank you very much, Dominique, for your kind words, and thanks to everyone for coming, and certainly we'll take on board all of your suggestions in one way or another, and including suggestions about remote participation, about our meetings and about our communications. And thanks once again.